Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody to the second CERC seminar of the week, which is also our second seminar in Indonesia. Some of you will remember we had a kind of Indonesian week last April, also two events on that country as well as one this summer. So we're developing a bit of a Indonesia emphasis. Max Lane's talk ended with a discussion of the importance of trade unions, and voila, we have a discussion of trade unions coming up. Before I introduce our speaker, however, let me do a little commercial announcement, or non-commercial in this case. Our next seminar is on the 6th of November. That's at 5 p.m. in room 2610 AC2. The speaker is a very interesting Singaporean oppositionist. Given some of the protests going on here in Hong Kong, it's interesting to look to Singapore. Dr. Chi Soon Wan will be talking about democracy and the market economy, examples of Hong Kong and Singapore. So he'll actually be comparing the two countries. After that, we have talks on Thailand. Dr. Alan Hinken, which I mentioned last time, coming up, as well as a talk by a prominent Burma historian, Maitri Ongtwin from the National University of Singapore. That's on the 24th. So that's all on our website. I'd like to offer a very gracious welcome to Dr. Michele Ford. We're very happy that she could join us today. She's been at CityU for a couple of days for a migration conference, and she's graciously decided to share even more of her time with us by giving us a seminar here. She is an Australian Research Council Future Fellow and Director of the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre at the University of Sydney. And as far as we can tell, this may be the largest Southeast Asia Centre in the world. It's gigantic. I mean, CERC is sort of this miniature version. I think you have over 100 or nearly 100 scholars working.
250, but you have to remember it's not the social sciences. It's
250. See, it gets bigger and bigger. So a very interesting, important centre at the University of Sydney. Professor Ford's research interests focus on the Indonesian labour movement, trade union aid, and trade union responses to labour migration. She's the author of a number of recent works on the Indonesian labor movement and on women and labor organizing, among other themes. Again, we're very pleased to have you today, and we look forward to your talk.
Thanks for coming. And it's great to see so many students in the audience. I look forward to your questions. Today I'm going to speak about a project that's been a long time in the making, that has really come together in the last 3 years, thinking about trade union engagement in elections. This project initially came out of work I did for my PhD some years ago, where I looked at how the institution, the way that trade unions were imagined, emerged in Indonesia, and how that affected NGOs' relationship with the labour movement in the period before the transition to democracy, when most labour activism was not within the state union, as we would expect, but in fact in alternative labour organisations, including labour NGOs. In that piece of work, I argued that really, in rejecting the Leninist theory about the role of intellectuals as the vanguard of the movement, as the what is the brains, the brawn of the trade unions, the New Order actually, in fact, reproduced the Leninist understanding of trade unions as primarily economic organisations. And although they imagined the role of the intellectual differently, they kept that divorcing of the intellectuals from the unions in a way that I thought at the time really influenced the way NGOs thought about their role in the labour movement. Of course, this project was very much also about unions. And since then I've been working on a number of things, including a project on the return of political unionism in Indonesia with a colleague of mine, Terry Carraway, who's based at the University of Minnesota. And effectively, what we're looking at is the increasing presence of organised labour as a political actor. Labour has been a political actor for a long time in various ways. What we mean by a political actor here is in fact in capital P politics, not just in small p politics, as was maybe arguably the case for a few decades before this. Not only are trade unions, and I'm talking here about formal trade unions with members who work in formal sector occupations increasingly mobilised, but they're also increasingly political. And I think it's very interesting, particularly in the period since 2005, to trace the emergence, or the re-emergence as it were, of political unionism, the involvement of unions first on the behest of political parties who started courting them as possible vote getters, in the very last days of the lead up to 2004, an intensification of that in the period leading up to the 2009 election, some interesting political experiments by unions in the 2009 elections, and then a significantly greater push in 2014. What I'm going to do today is take one small part of that project and talk to you about another thing that we've been thinking about, which is how what we know on the ground about what trade unions are doing in the political sphere engage with what a number of political economists think about the way that Indonesia is controlled, is ruled, and how democratic or undemocratic democratic transition has been. How many of you have read the work of Betty Hudson, Dick Roberson, or Jeffrey Winters on oligarchy? Okay, students, you need to read their stuff, because in lots of ways, the way that they understand Indonesian contemporary politics has been extremely influential, particularly for academics in Indonesia, but also for academics further afield. And one of our concerns when we put together this project, a book I edited with Tom Popinski based on a workshop we held a couple of years ago in Sydney, was that in many ways the arguments about oligarchy are very convincing, they're quite seductive in some ways, and they were being taken up by lots of scholars without real engagement with what the difference between them were or how they actually applied on the ground. So we got together in a room, a whole bunch of people some of whom don't normally get in the same room, and we had a good old chinwag about what their different understandings of oligarchy mean and how that actually compared to empirical cases in labour, in Islamic politics, in NGO politics, and so on. So in this book, my colleague Terry and I had a chapter that was on the labour movement, and our broad argument was that yes, we very much accept that the oligarchy literature has a lot to tell us about Indonesia, that really to understand politics in Indonesia you need to understand the politics of wealth and the way that the politics of wealth engages with the politics of politics, the everyday trench welfare, as it were, of the political process. But we think that this analytical focus on material power that is so closely associated with the oligarchy thesis needs a bit more unpacking if we're to understand what happens not in that big, broad stretch of history, but what happens in the months, the weeks, the years that we're actually looking at in the contemporary period. And the thing we take issue with in this body of literature is the position that theories of oligarchy take on mobilisation of power. And although theories of oligarchy acknowledge that in the abstract, mobilisation of power, the power of the collective, the power that you see in mass demonstrations and so on, can disrupt the power of oligarchs. The point is in Indonesia that unless we had a revolution, which is unlikely, and Max might disagree with me on that, it's not going to happen. That really it's inconsequential because they don't actually have enough power to disrupt the oligarchy. Now, what we're interested in is, to some extent, that's pretty obvious. There's not going to be a revolution in Indonesia anytime soon. But does that mean that mobilisational power is inconsequential? Or are we looking at the wrong thing? Is it all or nothing? Or does incremental change mean something in contemporary Indonesia? So we have a number of ways that we've tried to unpack this question. The first thing is that in terms of our methodology and in terms of our analysis also, we think that scale really matters. That it's not just about democratisation, not just about the fall of Suharto and what's come after, but also about decentralisation, the shift of the locus of political power from Jakarta very much more into the regions. And this has been very interesting because although it's quite clear that many of the same political actors are still very much in control of the processes out of Jakarta, you've got all these new local arenas, which actors, including labour movement actors, but also other actors outside the elite, can exercise their mobilisational power for political ends in new ways. This might be changing right now because the government has just, well not the government, the parliament has just rescinded the direct election of district head, which will become important as I speak later. But in the period that I'll be talking about today, it was very much still there, and to some extent I think they'll find it more difficult to wind back than perhaps they hope. So within these local arenas, what can we learn from the actions of organised labour? We think that the behaviour of oligarchs towards organised labour actually tells us something. Even if the theorists of oligarchy don't think labour matters at this level, the local oligarchs certainly do. There have been lots of cases, and I'll speak to you about a couple of them later, where people who control provinces, families who control provinces, almost with an iron rod, have courted Labor in the lead up to elections. Not because they love them, but because they think that, okay, I might have a lot of money, I might be able to buy a lot of this process, but ultimately I still need the votes. And if you don't have the votes, you don't get elected, and therefore you cannot continue to exert your political power. So that nexus around vote getting has become a very important tool for labour movements and other sorts of mass organisations at that local scale. The other thing that's interesting about scale is at the national level too, it's not entirely true that the oligarchs don't think about labour. We've got lots of little cases, and I won't speak so much about these today, but where in various situations, national politicians, but also other sorts of power brokers behind the politicians have tried to either buy off labour or tried to influence the way that they exert their power. And the example I'm going to speak to you about most directly with this today is not about legislative elections, but about the presidential election. So I'll speak about it last. Our other key point is we think that electoral victories are not the whole picture. In some local areas, Labor unions have managed to get up candidates from within their ranks and actually get them elected. Not many, some. And really, to be honest, what can they do after they've been elected? If you're 1 of 50, if you're 2 of 75, what can you really do? Not much. But what we think is important is not so much what happens afterwards, but that process itself. And we would argue that even where they fail, electoral experiments actually constitute a fundamentally different level of political participation for Indonesia's working class than we've seen in the last few decades. So, the project. This is the project that Terry and I have been working on. We've been looking at 2 electoral cycles, the 2009 cycle and the 2014 cycle, on 2 scales, at the national level and then locally in 5 union-dense districts. And they are in Java, Bekasi and Tangerang, which I'll talk a bit more about today, which are immediately to the very east, the immediate east and west of Jakarta. Gresik, which is an industrial area in East Java, which we chose all of them because they had different industrial profiles and different patterns of union influence. So in each of our 5 areas, the other 2 are Banten, which is near Singapore, on the island near Singapore, and Medan, which is a major city in North Sumatra. They all have very different industrial histories, different patterns of industrialisation, and different histories of union engagement. And we did that consciously. We tried to pick places where unions might have an influence, i.e. there were a lot of voters who may have some sympathy with unions, but we wanted to differentiate them on these other factors so that we could see which factors actually were most influential. We're also looking at various things. At the national level, we looked at policy contests over the manpower law, over social security, over a range of things. I'm not going to speak about those today. We also looked at the national executive elections, particularly the 2014 election. In 2009, Labor really didn't have much to do with the national executive election. This year, it's been quite interesting. At the subnational level, we looked at the local and provincial executive elections, and then also at the local legislative elections. And they're the ones where, as I mentioned before, Labor candidates were actually, in some cases, elected. So just a bit of background. We'll step back and think a little bit about the contemporary Labor movement. The Labor movement as it stands now, there are more confederations, but there are 3 large confederations. 2 of which, the first 2 grew out of the legacy union of the Suharto period, the state-run union of the Suharto period. The third came out of the major alternative union of that period. Associated with them, but also independent of them, there are about 90 national unions and federations. But the primary locus of organising within the formal sector is at the factory level, right? So you have a local union which may or may not be affiliated with a union at a higher level. Primarily, and this is partly a legacy of the New Order period, you can see that they're primarily in blue-collar manufacturing, but there has been in the post-Suharto period, and indeed in the mid to late 90s, some growth in white-collar occupations, especially banking and finance, and more recently some in the state-owned enterprises. Verified figures, this is where the Department of Manpower actually went out and checked things, aren't very often. So the most recent ones are in 2005, and of those 90 at that stage, 64 met the legal requirements for representation in industrial relations institutions. And as you can see, that wasn't a great deal. It's only 11% of the formal sector, and you have to remember that the formal sector in Indonesia is only about 30% of the economy. So we're not talking a lot of people in the unions. But what we are talking is a pattern of unionisation where they're clustered in particular areas, in particular industries, and that's where their bargaining power can come. Okay, so today I'm going to focus in my first part of my presentation on two cases with the legislative and executive head elections, and they are Bekasi, which lies to the east of Jakarta, and Tangerang, which lies to the west. I've put this table together to help you understand the differences between these places, which aren't that far apart, to be honest. The first is in the industrial profile, and you can see here that in Bekasi you've got a more capital-intensive industrial profile with quite a lot of dominance of electronics, automotives, quite a lot of Japanese investment, and especially in the metal sector, Japanese investments being very important as the birthplace of one of the major mainstream trade unions. In Tangerang, by contrast, you've got the dominance of textile, garments and footwear. And one of the interesting things about Tangerang is that this is one of the sites in the 1990s that international human rights organisations, some foreign governments, all sorts of people were in there trying to get help. Some of the anti-Nike campaign, all those sorts of organisations were in trying to help primarily women workers in these low capital, high labour intensive industries. So because of that, the trade union landscape is quite different. In Bekasi, it's dominated by the metal sector and it's dominated by two unions. One is the Federation of Indonesian Metal Workers Union, which is FSPME. The other is the metal federation that's associated with the confederation that grew out of the Suharto era union. Tangerang is quite different. You've also got the legacy union. You've got a union called SPN, which is predominantly in the garment, footwear and textile sector, but you also have a lot of smaller unions that grew out of the alternative union movement, alternative labour movement of the late Suharto period. Some of these were sponsored by NGOs, some were sponsored by student groups. A lot of those either collapsed into bigger unions or disappeared, but some of them have remained. So it's quite a more complicated situation, which becomes important later in our story. If we look beyond the legacy union, and that's not to write off the legacy union, because although it's pretty useless at the national level, in some areas its branch level unions are quite active and quite progressive. But if we take that aside, you can see that in Bekasi you have SPME is the dominant non-KSPSE union, and it's highly centralised, it's relatively effective, it's relatively well funded, both through dues from members and through its international networks. On the other hand, you have SPN, which again is relatively centralised, but declining in effectiveness and much poorer, both because it didn't take the opportunity to change its due structure, but also because the workers who tend to be in that sector are just poorer than workers in the metal sector, so they have less that they can contribute. It's also interesting, one of the reasons I'm focusing on these two of our 5 cases today is because in 2009, both FSPME and SPN had national level political strategies. Both of them actually involved the same party, PKS, which was the Prosperous Justice Party, which is a modernist Islamic party, which has been quite interesting and controversial over the last few years. In Bekasi's case, FSPME, at the national level there was no formal agreement, but the head of the union had a strong affiliation informally with this party, strong sympathy for this party, and did a deal where he actually ran in the Riau Islands for the National Assembly, and elsewhere the deal was that the party would place his union's candidates in their party lists. I'll tell you a bit more about that complicated situation later. In the case of SPN, they actually signed a formal memorandum of understanding, a formal political contract with that party in that election. And this was quite revolutionary because you have to remember that unions were quite, and this is why I mentioned my earlier work, were quite tentative about forming those kinds of links with parties in this period. An important thing about this differentiating between the national and the local scale, which I think is sometimes missing in analyses of Indonesian labour stuff, is that the political strategy at the local level is quite different from that at the national level, even in these relatively centralised unions, let alone in KSPSE, where local branches basically do what they like. So you can see in the case of Bekasi with the FSPME that this branch, which is actually the strongest branch for this union in the whole of Indonesia, they describe it as the motor of this union in Indonesia, ignored the national political strategy, didn't engage very much. In Tangerang, SPN, they'd had some political training actually from the Americans in the lead up to 2004, and so sort of grasped this idea about political engagement, and they went in boots and all, were very gung-ho about the 2009 elections. as I'll explain later, they got pretty burnt, and in 2014 didn't engage very much at all. So we've got this interesting thing, and that's why the diachronic approach is important, because we can see for different electoral cycles, different players have quite different strategies. Finally, in terms of local political context, you can see in Bekasi, I've described it as relatively diffuse. There are a number of parties with considerable influence. They jockey for power. Whereas in Tangerang, it was interesting because at the provincial and local level, it's really not controversial to call it a local oligarchy. And this was a quote we got from a politician in one of the local legislature who said to us, well, you know, here it's a case of here's the money and here's the machete. So you can take our money and do what we say, and if you don't, we're going to get you. It's very effective. Okay, let's talk about the legislative elections. I'll take it area by area now, having presented you with, I hope, an overview that gives you a bit of a comparative context. As I mentioned before, in Tangerang, a lot of parties were quite interested in politics, particularly SPN, which had the political contract with PKS. And you can see there from that first line that there are a number of union candidates stood for a number of parties. The only one who was elected was actually the guy from the PKS-sponsored Labour NGO, who was a lawyer, who actually got elected to the DPR, the National Parliament. What's interesting about this, I think, is not the fact that they weren't elected, but how much they learned about the technical aspects of campaigning and the politics of power. Quite often in Indonesia, trade unionists assume that because they have a lot of influence over their members in their factories and in their regions, that will translate into political support. But of course, supporting someone where you work for very narrow workplace interests is quite different from supporting them in the political field, where your ethnicity, your family's political history, all these other factors might influence you. This was quite a lesson for the trade unionists who stood in this election. To some extent, they took for granted the support that they would get, and they were sorely disappointed in the end. So some of them spent quite a lot of their money. In Banten, which I'm not talking about today, one guy was saying to me, oh, I had to mortgage my favourite car for this election. Sell my car, mortgage the house, but it didn't really pay off in many cases. The interesting thing about, one of the discourses around political engagement in these sorts, with working class political engagement and middle class proponents of Labour interests, is the thing that people desert you when they get elected. But in this case, the guy who was successful in Tangerang from the Labour NGO was actually quite active once he was elected with another parliamentarian who I'll talk about later, when it came through opposing revisions of the Manpower Law of 2003. If we wind the clock forward 5 years later, we can see that the landscape really changed in Tangerang. SPN, the union that had been so committed to politics in 2009, had decided that really it wasn't worth their while. This didn't mean that individual members of SPN didn't run, some of them still did, but as an organisation, they didn't have a political strategy and they didn't support those candidates in any particular way. What was interesting though is that the legacy union in Tangerang, in the sort of more, the peri-urban area of Tangerang, actually adopted many of the strategies that had been used in 2009 by other unions and ran quite a strong campaign and actually got a couple of people elected. So while the union that in 2007 had dominated, 2009 had dominated the election, pulled out, other players came in, which showed that there was still quite a lot of interest in the grassroots in political engagement. In Bekasi, it was quite different. As I mentioned before, they had these much less complicated landscape, two main unions, and in 2009, really, the local branch of FSPB basically just ignored the national directive, didn't really engage, even though somewhat other parts of Indonesia, FSPB was very active in that election. In 2014, though, FSPB went all out. It ran 9 candidates in one region. 2 of them were elected. You can see here from the illustration I've got here that it wasn't a matter of doing a deal with one political party. They actually took all their candidates, did deals with various parties for them to stand, made sure that no more than one union candidate was standing in the same electorate, which had been a problem in some of the other areas, and campaigned for them as a group. So these were union candidates. They were urging their members and sympathisers not to think about what party these people were from, but to think about their union affiliation, to greater or lesser effect. The other thing they did is they tried to be much more systematic about their political education in the lead up to the election. As in 2009 in Banten, which was one of our other case studies, they started pretty late, right? These things take time to get together. Trade unions aren't really designed to do these things. So it was only really in the 4 months in the lead up to the election that they actually started campaigning intensively. But there was some pretty serious work done in that period. I've just come from Jakarta, where I was interviewing some of the people in Bekasi, reflecting on that experience. And to some extent, many of the lessons that they learned are what the lessons that were learned in other areas in 2009. That really, your industrial power does not necessarily translate directly. Yes, they've learnt about the idea of not having more than one candidate in one electorate, but ultimately they still had a lot to learn about the technicalities of campaigning, as well as trying to focus the resources that they had, their limited resources compared to some of their opponents, in ways that could actually get results. This was interesting also because one of the other people running in this election was a woman called Rika, who was a national level politician who had been very supportive of this union and very engaged in some of their campaigns. She'd had a bit of a falling out with the union boss, and then the union ran a candidate in the electorate where she was running. So there was some, it was also an interesting lesson in how that sort of personality politics can interfere with the strategy, because that really didn't make sense. So just in summary, if we compare 2009 and 2014 in these two locations, I'll start with Tangerang, which is at the bottom, because it did these things all a bit earlier than in Bekasi. So in 2009, Tangerang worked very closely with PKS, the party that it had the MOU with. They weren't very happy with how PKS did that. They felt that the party didn't support the outside candidates, which kind of makes sense in lots of ways, but they weren't really expecting it. They also suspected, as in many electorates in Indonesia in 2009, that within the party itself, after the votes were in, the party shifted votes between its own candidates. This has a bit of a backstory, because before in Indonesia, in the 2004 election, the order on the party ticket really mattered, because basically you picked your party and the tickets flowed down. Just before the 2009 election, it was announced that Indonesia was moving to an open ticket system, which meant that if you were number 5 on the ticket, someone could still pick you. And this really upset the parties, because they really liked when they put the Labour candidates way down the bottom, got their votes, and then the votes flowed up to their party choices. What happened now was that in 2009 there was this threat, because if number 8 candidate on your ticket got a whole lot more votes than anyone else, they in fact would be the ones who got the position. So it changed the dynamics quite a lot. That's a bit of a side note, but I think an interesting one. You can see there that in Tangerang, initially they had 6 or 7 people from the union who were going to run with PKS. They ended up running 2. One polled very well, a woman who had been a long-term Labour activist. She didn't win, and she was very convinced that her votes had gone walking to other candidates. So when it came to 2014, people like her were very disillusioned. They certainly weren't going to run again. In 2014, in Tangerang, you can see that there was some, the Tangerang experiment and experiments of SPN in other electorates in Indonesia led to a situation at the Union Congress where they decided firmly that the union would not have a national political strategy in 2014. And this had big implications for local people, of course. They could still choose to run, but many of them were quite idealistic about running as union candidates, and that was no longer, if they ran as individuals. They could still maybe pull in some of the support from their members, but basically they were pretty disappointed. They had a pretty good go in 2009. But, as I mentioned before, the important footnote to that is SPN might have disengaged, but other unions started engaging in that space. In Bekasi, which was kind of an electoral cycle behind, even though the unions are much more established there in some ways, the big unions. In 2009, again, they chose to work closely with PKS. That strategy was taken up very strongly in Banten, which is another of our case studies, but not in Bekasi, even though Bekasi was the strongest of the branches of the union. And that was because the Bekasi branch was really was a bit cluey actually. They understood the risks of political engagement, were pretty suspicious, decided they'd sort of sit it out and wait and see. But by 2009, they decided that it was worth engaging. They ran these 9 candidates, they had this campaign, and you'll notice that the 2 people who did get elected from different parties. I know this is quite a lot of information, but I think the detail is quite important in trying to understand the nuances of how in different kinds of elections, with different kinds of union candidates in different kinds of situations, the outcomes are quite different. So I'm going to talk a bit about the executive elections in these two places now. So the first is the mayoral election in 2008 in Tangerang. Remember, this is before the 2009 election, where everyone started to really get involved in the legislative election. But this was the place where there'd been political education back in 2004 by an international organisation, the union had picked it up and so on. And inspired by that education program and their MOU, which they'd signed in 2007, they supported a candidate, not from that political party, from a different political party, but the guy they thought was likely to win. They actually signed an MOU, and the mayoral candidate, who did win, pledged to promote pro-worker policies in terms of their support. When we spoke to them a number of years later, they felt that he had more or less fulfilled his bargain. He'd had a bit of an open door policy with them. He'd welcomed conversations with them, and they were pretty happy with that. I'll tell you a little story on the side about this. I'll tell you later when we talk about the governor's elections. But this actually had a bit of a postscript to it. So they were pretty happy with that experiment. In Bekasi, in 2012, FSBME did support the winning candidate, but pretty half-heartedly. They really didn't support anyone. They publicly and privately they said they did a bit of a deal. Even though she wasn't the incumbent, they were pretty annoyed with the incumbent because they felt that he had not been open to workers during his time as district head. So in this case, it's a negative example, but the other example was a positive example. They had an agreement, they felt they got something out of it. Here, they felt that the mayor hadn't done much for them, therefore they punished him. Neneng promised some better law enforcement, but it's only 2012, we're really yet to see whether anything came out of it. The other major unions there, SBN, which isn't very strong in Bekasi, is the only one who signed a political contract. You can see there's a bit of a theme here with their political contracts. They signed it with PDIP, and you'll notice here that part of it was actually quite a direct benefit for unions in the form of some operational funds, but also with the broader issue of cracking down on outsourcing, which is where a company doesn't employ workers directly, but employs them through a labour hire company. SBSE had candidate for but not much else, and notice it was the textile garment and footwear branch of that, not the powerful metal workers in Bekasi who were engaged. So really pretty minor level engagement. When we come to the provincial executive elections, it's quite a different story. I want to start with Banten, which is the province in which Tangerang sits, the province to the west. And this is the example that perhaps speaks most closely to the oligarchy thesis and what we think the labour mobilisation stuff says to it. First of all, very few people, as I said before, would challenge the assertion that Banten has been a bit of a local oligarchy. Remember the money on the one hand and the knife on the other. The family of this local strongman had controlled a number, you can see there are a number of elected positions for a number of years. And his daughter was the governor. She was the incumbent in this race. She was a pretty powerful woman, but one of these more minor members of the family had had a local electoral race where they'd actually been defeated. So the family was a bit worried about this, and I think that's one of the reasons that we see that Atut, who was the daughter, actually engaged with Labour much more proactively in 2011. So this is Atut. She was the mayor from October 2005. The governor. She stopped being governor in May 2014 because she got put in prison for corruption. What's interesting about this race is that the mayor of Tangerang was running for it, right? He was the mayor that the union had a good relationship with, so he assumed that they would support them, right? But they didn't. Partly, this was because it was a no-brainer. Atut was going to win, and there's not much point supporting the loser. It's quite a common political logic in Indonesia. But the other thing which was very interesting is Atut was really active in courting the Labour vote. She invited union leaders to meet with her, she made pro-worker statements, she really made quite a bit of noise about why she thought workers was important, which is pretty interesting given that she's this really rich, really powerful person who, you'd wonder why she had to. And that's why I think it comes back to that argument that even where you have a whole bunch of money or resources, ultimately if elections are close, then the votes still matter. And so this raises the question, we think, of, if she's so powerful, why did she bother? One of the interesting side stories to this, this account is that one of the things about these district head elections is this: if you track, every year in Indonesia there are negotiations at the local level about minimum wages, right? Minimum regional wages. And if you track that against the electoral cycle, you can see that every time there's about to be a local election, they get a much bigger wage rise in these union dense areas than they do in the years between. And one of these reasons, of course, is that people who are incumbents, even if they don't support Labor, they don't want Labor to go out on the streets and cause a lot of problems for them in the electoral campaign. There's a wage story around this. Wahidin had, as the local mayor, had the responsibility of negotiating with, signing off on a tripartite negotiation about local wages. And they signed off on, the tripartite committee agreed, they signed off on it, but then there were lots of protests by the unions, the smaller unions, who were outside the people who were in the tripartite committee. So they came and protested against Wahidin, and he said, okay, I'll sign a higher one, I'll give you what Jakarta's getting, and sent them off to complain to the governor. So the protests moved from in front of the mayoral office to in front of the governor's office, and they, and at this stage there were a lot of protesters, and they were complaining about the wages. So ultimately, APA did the deal, but it was interesting to see then how this wage process, which you might think of being quite technical in some ways, became a political tool, not just for the unions who are seeking to use elections to increase their bargaining power, but also in inter-elite conflict in the electoral cycle. And I think this is the second feature that we think is really important about the engagement of mobilisational power with oligarchy. Now, the other one was the gubernatorial election in West Java. Rika, the woman I mentioned before in the National Parliament, was running for governor. And this was a really interesting case because her running mate, she was an actress, right? So high public profile, wealthy but not super wealthy. Her running mate was an NGO person. So it was really running as a civil society team. She had, at this stage, had been working with the unions for quite a long time. They had some big wins around social security. So they were the sort of relatively poor, clean team. It was interesting, in the lead up to this, they worked quite closely with some of the unions, to the extent that even, usually we think about, in the electoral cycle in Indonesia, it's about the politicians giving patronage to the people they're hoping to support them, right? But in this case, some of the unions actually raised money for this campaign. So it was an interesting political experiment in terms of that relationship between the patron and client in the electoral cycle. She didn't win, but they did pretty well. And it was quite interesting in the sense that her presence and her role in these social security campaigns meant that they really did get a lot of unions on board. There was quite a lot of a unifying factor through that campaign. Unfortunately, the committee of the sort of unified committee of the unions that support her later self-destructed. And if I had time, I could tell you about that story, but it's too long and complicated to hear. But if we look at these examples, we can see that really, even though the unions aren't particularly big, they aren't particularly strong, because they have particular types of bargaining power in these two union-dense regions, they had a significant, not a determining, but a significant influence on the executive elections in these two areas. So again, working backwards, you can see in Tangerang, local election, you have this experiment where you have a formal agreement, and I mean, how much it actually achieved is an open question, but the unions felt that it achieved something. In Bekasi, they were still being quite tentative about the local executive elections. But then you had this gubernatorial race in Tangerang where it's very clear to union strategists in Jakarta as well as in the district that unions really did have an influence, and I think that also then affected how they responded to the 2013 race in Bekasi. Okay, talking a lot here, I'm going to wind up soon so that we can have some questions and comments. But I thought you'd be interested in the 2014 presidential elections and the role of Labor there. And I think it's, again, I think it is very relevant in the context of this framework I've given you today about oligarchy, because few people would dispute the fact that although Jokowi was backed by some very powerful financial interests, if you had to pick between Jokowi and Prabowo was definitely the candidate of the oligarchs. This election has really put the cat among the pigeons. The guy in the blue shirt is Said Iqbal, who's the head of a union called, of the FSPME, the Metal Workers Union that I was talking about before in Bekasi in particular, which, you know, many international observers would consider the most effective, best structured and so on union in Indonesia at the moment, which isn't to say it's perfect, but relatively speaking. And who knows who the other man is? That's Prabowo. Very interesting. So you've got the union that people would think is, of the mainstream unions, the most sort of committed to working class interests, and you've got the candidate of the oligarchs, and they're standing in the big arena at Senayan. This is on May Day, and Iqbal's coming all out for Prabowo, saying we're supporting Prabowo in this election because Prabowo, and this is the interesting thing, had signed off on a list of 10 demands around workers. It wasn't announced in that forum, but Prabowo had also promised Iqbal and a number of other key people that they could have, well, Iqbal could have the Ministry of Labour, and another number of key people could be in there. Now, some people interpreted this in quite a cynical way. Personally, having interviewed Iqbal many times over the years, I think, you know, generally, everyone's got an ego, everyone wants to get somewhere, but generally he is quite genuinely committed to labour interests, and I think he would have seen it as a way of promoting workers' interests on a whole new level, beyond the level of his union in his public policy sphere. I wrote a piece just after May Day pointing out my concerns about the dangerousness of this situation, because the trouble is if Prabowo won, even if he did follow through on his promises to meet these points and make Iqbal minister, chances were, given his track record, his reputation and so on, that somewhere that was going to come unstuck, and that Iqbal would end up in a very difficult position. And although he's not the only player in the labour movement, he's certainly a key one. If he lost, which is in fact the case, as you know, it would put FSB in a very difficult position. To make this even more complicated, all the other major unions supported Jokowi. They have FSB and the Confederation to which it's aligned on one side, and all the other unions behind Jokowi. There is this very different, important qualitative difference though. Whereas on the Prabowo-Iqbal side, there was this list of agreements that had policy discussions. Prabowo had also, like Atut, been very diligent in courting the Labour vote. He'd turned up at a whole lot of their functions, he'd been available, he'd been supportive. Jokowi was invited to things but didn't turn up, wasn't that interested. So there was a bit of personality politics there as well, and maybe high-level strategy from the oligarchic candidate. On the other side, the unions that supported Jokowi didn't have any firm political agreement with him. They supported him because they wanted to support him. They didn't actually have any structured discussions or any promises of what he would deliver. Having said that, you have to remember that Jokowi had demonstrated as Mayor of Solo and as Governor of Jakarta a commitment to universal healthcare and other social security measures for the poor. So he was the more obvious candidate for a working class organisation, but he certainly didn't make any policy promises or direct representations about what he would offer. And in fact was quoted in some newspaper coverage as using language that really harked back to the New Order, where really workers shouldn't make trouble, they should just negotiate with their bosses and do their job and keep their heads down. So it's not a black and white situation. It's not a confusing situation, but it's certainly not black and white, because neither candidate, Jokowi, who should be the pro-worker candidate, is not necessarily quite so pro-worker. So you had this campaign, you had a lot of conflict with it, and this is also the interesting thing. As I said to you before, often union leaders assume that their industrial influence translates into political interest, and this was a very clear example of where that doesn't happen. Although Iqbal was strong enough to keep the structure of the union and to discipline people, most people except one, in the structure of the union who were not naturally in agreement with what he had done, at the grassroots, initially many workers were quite dissatisfied with this. They didn't think it was the right thing. They would have supported Jokowi. It's interesting, I was talking to some of the strategists about this, and they said actually the thing that brought ordinary members round within MSPME wasn't representations from the union elite, but actually from the fact that Jokowi, every time he was filmed, the head of the Employers Association seemed to manage to get himself in the picture behind Jokowi. So that association between Sofian Wanandi and Jokowi then became a push factor for grassroots members of FSBME to maybe come to the union line a bit more than they had. In terms of consequences, FSBME is definitely in the doghouse right now with the rest of the union movement and with the incoming government. And their response has been to go back to basics. Put your head down, shut up about politics for a while, and think about wages and conditions and social security, pensions, that sorts of things. Follow through on some of those sorts of bread and butter issues, the sorts of issues we think of as being associated with economic trade unionism, which is something that Iqbal had been trying to move beyond in this last 10 years or so. Probably quite sensible, though there's a risk, if he can, especially with things like this change to the law about the district head elections, that his silence is read as ongoing relationship with Prabowo and the coalition of parties that supported Prabowo, who are actually now much more influential in the national parliament than any other opposition has really ever been. Because normally what happens is when your candidate loses, the parties all sort of end up trying to reposition themselves so that they're closer to the party, to the incoming president. That hasn't happened so far, and in this cycle, what we've seen is almost a solidification of the parties around Prabowo, and they have the majority in parliament, so it's interesting times in terms of that. In terms of the labour movement's experiments in public policy, we have a situation where quite a lot of really important work done in the last few years trying to get some of the major players together on issues of shared interest. Yeah, that's stopped. People aren't talking to each other right now. It's quite complicated. And my personal interpretation is unless there's a serious effort on both sides, and that will be the way it is for some time to come. So where does this leave us? Effectively, we would argue that these kinds of engagements are important. It's not actually about whether union candidates get into the electorate, whether candidates necessarily fully commit themselves to the cause of the industrial working class. It's actually the way that these experiments have opened up a fundamentally different level of political participation for Indonesia's working class. One of my favourite examples of this is a guy I interviewed who worked in Kentucky Fried Chicken in Surabaya in 2007. You know, okay, he wasn't in the factory, he was in KFC, not a great job though. And his comment was, he had quite a lot of, he'd been involved in some small unions that were associated with some NGOs. And the parties had come knocking on his door, not just one, but several, asking him to run through. And this really surprised him. And his comment was, why me? I'm one of the little people in Indonesia. Why would I have a voice in politics? Remembering that in the New Order, people weren't even supposed to have an opinion in between elections, let alone get engaged. So these approaches, and then the way that unions and other parts of the labour movement have tried to rather than just following what parties do, but try to influence the pathways, I think has been really important in terms of educating and engaged citizenry. And I think this is certainly something that perhaps hasn't reached down to the everyday members, but it's certainly been a very important, I think, change in the way that working class Indonesians see their role in Indonesian politics. The other interesting thing has been, as I mentioned before, this response of the local and national oligarchs, which suggests that even though the theorists of oligarchy might think that they matter, local oligarchs certainly do. It might not be their primary factor of consideration when they're planning their strategies, but they certainly, both in the case of people like Atut, but also in the people like Prabowo, are investing considerable time, resources and energy into their relationship with key unions. Again, I'm not making any claims about what outcomes come out of this, but I think the process in itself is important. So in terms of our broader thinking of about politics in Indonesia, we conclude the following. First, that Labour's electoral experiments don't constitute challenge to assertions about the dominance of material power in Indonesian politics, but these very grassroots, very everyday examples of how parties and oligarchs have attempted to woo the unions and really show that there has been a substantial, a real change in the way that the political system engages both with the working class and with wealth. And finally, basically in terms of theoretical implications, we think this means that much more serious empirical consideration of mobilisational and other kinds of power, whether it be discursive power, which is also not well covered in the oligarchy thesis, is necessary than the oligarchy thesis allows if we're actually to understand the developments, the everyday trench warfare of contemporary Indonesian politics. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michele. We now have some time for questions.
Thanks, Michele. I just got a question about the 11% you mentioned.
The 11.
The 11% of the
Of the 30%.
Is that figure a figure just for Bekasi and Tangerang, or was that a figure for the whole?
No, that's a national figure, and it's a very conservative figure, right? Because not all the unions have the documentation process. So, I mean, I like to use it because it's the bottom line. But you have to remember, as I was suggesting, that because Indonesia's industrial profile is skewed to particular areas, the density of union members in some industrial centres is much higher, and Bekasi is a clear example of that.
And is that figure, is it growing, or I mean, I just wonder if you could give us a sense of the size. Is it sort of fluctuating, or? It's
fluctuating. Unions experienced a large growth initially after '98, and then what happened was a number of things. One thing is, employers sort of got their act together. They weren't used to having to actually think about these things very strategically, and came up with a number of strategies to contain unionism, one of which was increasing the use of outsourced workers. And in Indonesia, as in many countries, unions aren't very good at organising people who aren't in full-time permanent jobs. So by relying more on outsourced workers, you get the turnover, you make it harder for unions to keep their core numbers. They did threaten to close down a bunch of factories because workers were becoming too militant. This was, you know, a big public issue in 2002, 2003, 2004. Some companies did that and relocated, but actually not many did for that reason. There has been some attrition, particularly in garment, textile, and footwear, where companies just aren't surviving. So company profiles, industrial profile is also affecting it. But actually, in terms of real union members as opposed to just numbers that people claim, which of course, mean that these are possibly a bit inflated. Yeah, I think there's growing solidity in a few key unions. But then there's a lot of unions that are very much just on paper. So it's not, I mean, the international labour movement always cites Indonesia as its good news story. An example where a developing country has really made progress in terms of engaging in this area. I don't think that's wrong, but I think it's important to understand what it's being compared to and what it really means on the ground.
Hi, thanks for sharing very exciting observation. I have two questions. One is, you mentioned about several union members who succeeded in getting elected. To my understanding, their political behavior might be not too different from other politicians who have different backgrounds and do not have background in union movement. And I think to build this momentum, I guess their political behavior that is different from the other politicians would be important. But what's your observation about that?
Can I answer that one first?
Yeah, sure.
So this is important, of course. This isn't the first time that Labour candidates have been elected. Pahan's party had a few elected, particularly in Sumatra. Some of those I interviewed in Batam, you might have interviewed them too, Nan. And there was this real feeling that either they didn't behave very differently or they got lost in the system. One of the interesting images we saw after this recent election is the two, there was a picture of the successful candidates in Batam from FSPME, and then some of the union, and they had cowbells in the picture. And the message from the union was, you might be in there, but you're still responsible to us. Now, how much that plays out when they get in there, I'm not sure, but I reckon there's more chance that they'll keep a closer link with FSPME than with the other unions, because the internal discipline of FSPME is much stronger. So I think it'll be interesting over the next 5 years to see how much, even if they don't achieve anything, your question is about behaviour, whether they behave differently in that context. So I think that's a really good observation, and I think the Bekasi case will be the one to watch to see if that changes at all. Yeah.
My second question is with the change of the electoral system, in which now independent and individual candidates can get elected through the amount of votes they receive. So from the perspective of the political parties, I think having weak candidates, like from the working class, women, other minorities, would be actually beneficial because they can actually secure the votes for the candidates from the parties. So that I think my point is that
so in the
there could be more
or
in the legislative elections. So my point is that probably there will be more candidates from the unions, from other social categories, because the political parties would see that they need to really secure the strong candidates of the party.
Yeah, this was certainly the assumption before the open tickets, and I think to some extent it still holds. But there have actually been, trouble is, in some of these things the union candidates aren't so weak. So there have been, so even in one of the electorates where at the provincial level in Bekasi, where the FSPB candidate didn't get up, he actually beat the second rung candidate, and the only reason he didn't get a seat is because PKS, with all the scandals, lost a big chunk of their votes and only got one seat. But he actually, there were two really strong internal party candidates. He was number 8, but on votes he was number 2. And Iqbal, when Iqbal ran in the Riau Islands in 2009, he came in third with a very slim margin to number 2, and there were 2 in the electorate. So it doesn't always pay off that way. And I think the parties in areas where there are very strong figures are quite aware of the risks. And the case of Siti in Tangerang that I was talking about before is one of those. You know, you can't prove it, right, but she probably, according to all the people we've talked to, and not just Labor people, she probably got enough voters to be elected. So the parties adjusted. And I spoke to some PKS party members in Batam about this and in other cases, and I didn't ask them straight away if they were redistributing the votes, but I asked, and they said yes, basically. That yes, parties had redistributed votes between their own candidates, and they didn't actually really see that that was a problem. So I think, there's been a lot of talk about that in the 2014 round, but it's still a big challenge in terms of the Electoral Commission's capacity to actually discipline the internal workings of parties in the vote count.
My question is about the trade union's decision to enter more actively into electoral politics. Do they have some models in mind from some other countries? Because I think a lot of trade unions in different countries have, controversies. I mean, debates among themselves whether it would detract from basic work democracy. So I'm just curious.
It's a key tension in trade unions around the world, certainly. After '98, there were lots of international labour movement actors who went into Indonesia, and all of them brought their models with them. So you can see that many of Indonesia's unions, have evolved in their own way, but in many ways they've been shaped very much by the imaginings of their international interlocutors, whether it be through the provision of good examples, whether it be the way they spend their money, and so on. One of the most influential countries in terms of this engagement with politics has been Germany, in fact. Germany's had a long history of engagement in Indonesia around the labour question. They're actually, a German political foundation was actually responsible, actually sponsored the seminar in 1973 where the system, the really restrictive system of the previous regime was formed. And if you look closely at it, it's actually got many of the characteristics of German industrial trade unionism in its language and in its shape. Obviously, it operated quite differently. That foundation, which actually is not allowed to do trade union work anymore in Indonesia because it got a bit too political in the lead up to the 2009 election, was the key interlocutor around getting unions away from wages and conditions and starting to think about things like social security policy and also starting to really engage in the political area. And they have had an office in Indonesia, right? So that makes them a bit different too from many donors. The other one that has an office in Indonesia and has been influential are the Americans, who have also been there since the late 60s. And they don't have much money, neither does the Germans actually, but in terms of influence, they were the organisation that did the political training before 2004 in Tangerang that got SPN thinking about politics. So it was voter education, voter awareness. And the idea for them then was to get this list of things that mattered to workers, give it to every single candidate in an election and say, okay, where do you stand on this? And then just publish the results to their members. So they weren't so keen on the actual direct engagement. They were more interested in the lobbying side of politics. The Germans were very interested in direct engagement. The Dutch have also had their finger in this pie. Their formal programs with FSPME aren't political, but they've certainly informally supported political stuff, and they've known some of the money that they've provided has engaged in politics. So they're the three main ones that have engaged. But often people will ask questions about the Australian system where we have a Labor Party. They'll ask about other countries where there's a Labor Party that's got a relationship with trade unions. They're quite interested in that way. They have a strong rhetorical commitment to keeping their independence from a party, and their experiences in the last few elections have shown them that it's very hard for them to manage their relationships with existing parties. The trouble is, the few experiments there have been to establish a Labor Party haven't been very successful. So they're quite tentative. They understand the risks and the sort of preparation they have to do that. But organisations like MSP, that's their long-term plan. They'd like to see, if not a Labor Party, a party that was interested in grassroots issues, that was maybe a broader social coalition. But ideally they'd like a Labor Party, but failing that, they'd like to work on this. But I think that's a very long-term project right now.
So what's the theoretical takeaway? Really? I mean, you're wanting to critique oligarchy theory, but replace it with what? So you talk about what, industrialization, Tangerang and Bekasi, and mass mobilization and formation of a working class, I guess, and they're increasingly interested in participating in elections, and they can even win a few contests. But afterwards, it seems like the policy gains are minimal, very modest. So there's no real payoff. It doesn't seem. And if that's the case, I'm wondering how really this does challenge oligarchs and their interests, because Winters does expressly say that oligarchs are quite comfortable with and quite compatible with political democracy. So if they're not really giving, and they don't really have to hold office themselves. In fact, the only oligarch in the region who ever has was Thaksin Shinawatra. And otherwise, they're content to let others take political positions, and they can still protect their interests quite adequately.
Yep, absolutely.
So how do you challenge the piece?
So the theoretical takeaway, as I said in my opening slides, was not to, we're not suggesting that you drop oligarchy and put something else in its place. What we're challenging the theorists of oligarchy to do is to think or speak in a more nuanced way about what mobilisational power means, about what other sorts of non-concrete power, non-material power, like discursive power, like all those sorts of things affect what they're talking about. So we're not actually throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're quite comfortable with the overarching thesis that material wealth is a determining factor in Indonesian politics and is likely to be that way for a very long time to come. So we're quite comfortable with the idea, and I think Winters is much more, Winters' theory of oligarchy is much more accommodating of the democratic transition than Robeson's and Hadis's is, which is very much tied to their understanding of the new order. So if we're between the two, we'd push towards the Winters end, but we'd say within the Winters end, okay, it's all very well to say we don't have to worry about mobilisational power unless there's a revolution, but in fact, it's not an all or nothing question as I argued before. So the theoretical takeaway is this is not black and white, it's grey. And that if we want to understand what's happening on the ground in Indonesian politics, we have to engage with the grey, even if it's not as pretty, even if it's not, it doesn't make it quite as nice a narrative. Politics is messy. That's the takeaway.
Michele, if I could follow up, you mentioned in passing that there have been some efforts to establish a kind of Labour Party in Indonesia, and I presume that there's some internal politics involved. But beyond that, although I'd be interested to hear perhaps a few more details on that, I'm also interested in some broader issues. For example, the legacy of the new order and the crackdown on the Communist Party, the general banning of left-wing activists, the repression of particularly labor activists throughout the new order, the attempt to form a left party was particularly strongly repressed in the late Suharto period and so on. What kind of legacy that or impact that still has, despite now over a decade and a half of political openness. Also, the strength of traditional parties that are rooted perhaps in a very shallow sense in some of the traditional cleavages, also religious cleavages in Indonesia. And you mentioned, even though people are workers, they also have their family voting traditions and so on, and that seems to matter more in Indonesia than some other places in the region. And of course, thirdly, the question of industrialization generally in the country and the relatively weak or the limited extent of industrialization, the weak impulses behind it, say, compared to some of the tiger economies of Northeast Asia?
You're really going to talk, don't you? Okay, start with the Labour parties. And the early attempts to form a Labour, and the relationship with the Suharto discourse and so on, the early attempts to form a Labour party was interesting. Within weeks of Suharto stepping down, some of the really old-time Labour people within the official state union had declared Labour parties. They didn't go very far, partly one of them died in the process. But the other one was Mukta Patpahan, who had been the leader of the SBSE, what was it, SBSE. And he actually, as I mentioned before, some of their candidates did actually get elected. They weren't necessarily workers, but they were candidates for the Labour Party on the Labour agenda. But one of the big problems with that is the union that he headed was fairly closely tied to a particularly ethnic group. So although it wasn't limited to that ethnic group, there was perception that it was pretty much limited to that ethnic group, so and to that union. So other unions really didn't, if any, they might have actually, so in some cases they're actually quite proactively against it, but they certainly weren't necessarily for it. So there was the internal politics of that. In terms of your broader question of the legacies of the Suharto era, yeah, I think that's really important, and that's why I mentioned my earlier work, because I think that legacy of thinking about unions as being purely economic, and purely economic in a very limited understanding of what even economic means, had a very long half-life in terms of the labour movement. It took, if you think about it, 2004 was already 5-6 years after the fall of Suharto. It wasn't really till 2009 that unions were seriously thinking about politics, and the debates within the movement were quite strong. So a lot of mainstream trade unionists still thought that they shouldn't be engaged. Partly because of what you were saying before about the tension between achieving the economic ends of unions and the risk that politics plays to it, but a lot because of the way the unionists had come to think about politics in the New Order period, where it was all about capture of trade unions by political party. You know, the historical discourse about unions in that period was all about how the unions had been captured by the parties. So I think that's had a long half-life. The broader question of political engagement in the Suharto period clearly has had an impact on what everyday people think is their engagement in politics, and that's where I think one of the achievements of this is worth recognising. One of the other things we've been doing as part of this project is we've done 2 surveys now of 400 workers in Bekasi and Tangerang. So the those areas I talked about today, one of which had 100 members of the main union in that area, 50 union members of other unions, and then 50 non-unionised workers. And when we did it in 2010, looking at the 2009 election, there was a very weak correlation even in the stronger unions between voter behaviour or even awareness of union candidates and their voting, their actual voting choices. We've just run that again, and so we're very interested to see how it comes out in Bekasi, now that in this electoral cycle where FSBME has been much more active, but unfortunately the data's not crunched yet, so I can't give you any insight there. Your second question was, just remind me?
It was all the same question.
All the same question.
Just other factors that might be, I mean, the character of Indonesian industrialization.
Yeah, that was the third bit. Anyway, I'll deal with that. Clearly, the capacity of a Labour Party to function and flourish is very much compromised in many ways by the industrial profile of Indonesia. So you've got these pockets of quite heavy industrialisation, Batam, Medan, Batam and Bekasi mostly, Tangerang, Medan. But the electoral laws in Indonesia, even though there's now room for independent candidates in some limited circumstances, the electoral rules really do favour parties that have a strong presence in many provinces, in many districts. So that mitigates against any kind of party emerging from sectoral interests that only work in particular parts of the country. So in terms of politics, that's, I think, the main impact of the industrial profile. The other thing is, of course, because so many people are in the informal sector, then a working class politics does not necessarily come through a trade union, because trade unions are only focused on particular types of workers, right? I guess FSBME and its allies' attempts to engage with the universal social security question was an attempt to try to broaden that base. But realistically speaking, in the near future, medium term, I can't see that there's going to be any organisational base for that broader social platform. And so that's where unions have their strength. They do have the organisational base. Their weakness is they're in such a small part of the economy and in so they're in such a limited number of real places.
If there are no other questions, then thanks again very much.